Hi, I'm Will Johnson, also known as Power Nerd Insights. I work as a senior Power Platform specialist for Vantage 365, and I'd like to welcome you to this Power Nerd presentation. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Friday's learning session. We're taking a bit of a different tact with these sessions now. So, we're actually going to start a multi part series. This is going to span a fair few weeks across the Friday learning sessions, and we're going to be covering the PL-200 course content. So we're starting off with a little bit of a course overview this week, and we're going to dig in quite heavily into Dataverse. We've got quite a packed agenda, and we're going to kind of go through as much as we can in terms of the PL-200 Dataverse content and see what we can learn. So today's session, what's the agenda? Well, as usual, we have an introduction. That's where we are now. We're going to start with a bit of an overview of the PL-200, so that's what skills it kind of covers, what parts of the technology it might look at, and a few other little bits. We'll also outline the role of a functional consultant. So for those who are unaware, the PL-200 certification is a Power Platform Functional Consultant certification. It's slightly different from the other certification that's on the same level of PL-400, which is a Developer Associate. They both have slightly different content in them, and yeah, they work slightly differently. So we're going to look at what the role of a functional consultant is and give it a bit of context in terms of the kind of wider Power Platform kind of delivery space. We're then going to make a start on the title topic of this session. So as you can see there, we've got basic Dataverse. We're going to be looking at table creation, what the options are, dig into the different table types, the different types of record ownership, and a few other bits. We're going to look at table management itself. So these are things like how we create columns, what the options are there to customize our tables, and a few other bits. We're going to look at relationship management because Dataverse is obviously a relational database at its core. So we need to understand how we do our relationship management and what that looks like. We're then going to dig into security rules. So this is how we make sure our tables and data are secure within our Power Platform environments. How we might group people, because obviously if you've done any work with Dataverse and security roles, you know that individually assigning security roles to everybody who comes in is a bit of a nightmare. So we need to understand how we group people together. And then we're going to look at the additional security options that are provided to us through the use of Dataverse. And then as usual, we'll have our discussion section at the end. But first things first, as we always do, bit of rules of engagement. So these are essentially how we engage with the session. So during the course of the session, obviously I'll be talking. If you have any questions, please do post them in the chat during the course of the session. Like I said, Jace will try to pick them up. And if you have a question that you want to verbally ask, please wait for the discussion section at the end. As a point, I am a firm believer in there is no such thing as a stupid question. I have a 4-year-old daughter. She tests that assumption every day, and we haven't found a stupid question yet. So please do post your questions. We are here to essentially learn and try to help each other. So give those questions and ask. With that being said, let's get straight into it. The first topic on the agenda being the PL-200 overview. So what is the PL-200? Well, headliner is that the PL-200 tests your ability to implement, configure, and extend Power Platform. And when we talk about the implementation, configuration, and extension of Power Platform, it's quite a wide-ranging topic. So this exam is quite wide-ranging when it comes to the Power Platform. It covers a multitude of areas, including Dataverse, Power Apps, Power Automate, more specifically Power Automate Cloud Flows. The PL200 used to cover desktop flows, but with the new syllabus, it doesn't. It also covers Power Pages, Power BI, and Power Platform Administration as a whole. So this is things like how to set up environments, how to configure environments, and a few other little bits, which we'll dig into a bit later. The exam overall looks to assess your ability as an individual to perform discovery with clients, capture their requirements, engage subject matter experts such as a solution architect or others, and then engage with stakeholders, configure the solutions based upon the requirements and discussions with SMEs and stakeholders, and then build those solutions using Power Platform. Overall, some of the key skills it's going to look at and it will test will be your ability to identify requirements and build solutions leveraging the Power Platform. So with that explanation, you can see that the PL-200 isn't just about your technical capability here. There is some soft skills tests in there in terms of identifying the difference between things like functional requirements versus non-functional requirements. And you also find this in some of the kind of further up exams, whereas the things like PL-900 and the old PL-100 used to be more about the actual construction of solutions. We start to get into the realm of being tested on some of the soft skills elements as well. So it's useful to note that obviously when it comes to the PL-200 and this series as a whole, we aren't always going to be discussing some level of technical capability. We aren't always going to be digging into different parts of the Power Platform interface. Sometimes it will just be a theoretical discussion around what's the difference between a functional requirement versus a non-functional requirement. What questions do we ask and bits like that. So that's an overview of the PL-200. But I mentioned that obviously the PL-200 is a Power Platform Functional Consultant certification. So what is the role of a functional consultant? Well, overall headlines, the role of a functional consultant in terms of the Power Platform, that role is to implement, configure, and extend Power Platform solutions to meet identified business needs, making sure that the business as a whole adopts Power Platform and the solutions created in the easiest manner. And this can be broken down into a few areas. So the first thing that implements, configures, and extends, right? Part of the one of the main parts of kind of implementing a successful Power Platform solution is a really good requirements session. So when we speak with kind of our user groups and others, we as a functional consultant will be looking to identify business needs, and this includes engaging with those stakeholders to understand what their current processes are, what the pain points are for them, what challenges they face, and what their desired outcomes are. Alongside that, obviously, part of what you would do as a functional consultant would be to try and get the solution to align alongside kind of the core IT strategy of the business. It's all well and good having a brilliant Power Platform solution for one part of a process, but if that doesn't integrate with the wider process or the wider business, you're building a siloed solution. As a functional consultant, you're there to make sure that that doesn't happen. So you need to ensure that any Power Platform solution you're working on map directly to kind of organizational goals and actually add measurable value. So this is things like time saved metrics or reductions in error rates, things like that. Alongside that, as a functions consultant, you're there to do an element of design and configuration as well. So you're there to, in some cases, alongside a solution architect, translate the requirements that have been identified into some kind of solution architect or solution architecture or solution design. This is things like configuring apps and flows and data models in Dataverse to make sure that they meet the business need. You're also there as a functional consultant to deal with the governance and security. So we always say think security first because obviously nobody wants their data to get into the hands of people who shouldn't have it. So as a functional consultant, you're also there to establish best practices for access control, data security, and compliance within the Power Platform. Uh, Again, functional consultant role doesn't just end at the point of developing a solution and then putting it in a test. You're also going to be there for the process of the testing and refinement of these solutions. So you're there for essentially end-to-end solution testing, making sure that you gather user feedback and refine kind of any user feedback into tasks, and make sure that you have an element of making sure that you're kind of prioritizing that for a good level of impact. Now, in certain situations, you in certain businesses, you may have a project manager or a tester or a QA who kind of manages that aspect for you. But obviously, for the purpose of the exam, this is something that may be tested there, and it's something you need to be aware of. And then one of the key things in terms of the role of a functional consultant, you are going to be dealing with a lot of collaboration in terms of between the dev team or yourself and the dev team and the stakeholders and customers. So there's a lot more customer engagement at this point. But yeah. And then the other role of a functional consultant, but I argue this is part of the functional consultant piece, but really it's part of working in the Power Platform. The other role of a functional consultant is continuous improvement. You need to stay updated on new Power Platform capabilities and kind of make sure you're aware of them so that if something changes in Power Platform and it means that a requirement that may not have been achievable in the past is now achievable, you should then be looking to implement that. But yeah, that is overall some of the highlights and headlines of the role of a functional consultant and kind of a bit of an overview. So this is more the soft skills element and gives us a bit of context as to what we're learning in terms of the technology and the PL-200 series as a whole. But this is all theoretical. We're developers. We like the actual doing of things. So we are going to get into the basics of Dataverse. So with all that being said about the role of a functional consultant and what the exam covers, we're going to dive into the tech. So for those that have worked with me or I have taught previously, uh, you'll know that I always start with the data. I always say that the data structures that you build your applications on decide whether your application works well or works poorly. So we're going to be covering Dataverse first because that is the foundation of our applications. So today we'll be covering essentially what Dataverse is, how it works, how we build tables in it, and a few other little bits as you saw in the agenda. But first things first, what actually is Dataverse? Well, putting it simply, Dataverse is Microsoft's offering of a cloud-based data storage in terms of relational databases. It sits quite keenly at the heart of Power Platform, and you'll find a lot of Power Platform devs talking about Dataverse versus SharePoint versus SQL as the data storage, and there is a lot that is enabled in Power Platform when you build a solution off of the back of Dataverse. It allows us to create relational database with ease without the need to know things like SQL or other database languages. It is another low-code interface or no-code interface to building relational databases. And not only this, it's not just a database. It's also got a load of inbuilt features that make things like security and process automation a lot simpler and a lot easier. And some of those we're actually going to look at today. So, first things first, how do we actually get into Dataverse? Well, as I've said, Dataverse is a database system, so we need to know about how we create tables. So when we look at how we create tables, it's relatively easy. What we should see is essentially the data Power Platform environment. So you can see on the left when you come into Power Apps, you've got this tables option here. You can also find this in Power Automate, but it's normally in the More section and then you have to pin it. But for the purpose of today, we're going to go into Power Apps and go into tables. You'll notice that when you come into a Dataverse enabled environment, you have a number of tables that are marked as standard and virtual and other bits. These are essentially different table types that are available to us. When we look at the table types that are available to us, you can see on the screen I have standard, virtual, and I should have another one in here somewhere. He says activity tables. So as you see, different types of tables in there. These all do mean something, but what we're going to do to actually walk through is we're going to create a new table. Now, in Power Platform at the moment, when you hit new table, you have a few options. You have create new tables. This takes us through the Copilot way of doing it, which is essentially describing using natural language how to create that table, what it should look like. Uh, for the purpose of kind of practicing the PL-200, um, what we really want to be looking at is the table advanced properties. This was the old way before Copilot came in of creating these tables. For now, we're going to ignore create a virtual table because I'll discuss about what they are in a few minutes. But if I hit table, advanced tables, you can see here I have a display name. I can choose a display name. I'm going to call this a testing table because I'm original. I like to give them good names. You'll see it has a plural name there, which is obviously the pluralized version of that. And then you have an advanced options drop down and this enable attachments bit. So when we're looking at tables and we're going through things, we have this type drop down here. Now I mentioned about obviously the types here. There are a few types that we have available to us when we create a table. We have standard, activity, virtual, and elastic. Standard tables are essentially just a normal table, right? They're what we generally use most of the time. The other thing that you might see for standard tables is that standard tables are tables that have come as part of the Dataverse environment. So things like, your activity table is a standard table. An account table is a core table, that kind of thing. But standard tables are essentially just a normal table. We then have activity tables underneath the type. Activity tables are a special kind of table and are best for activities with things like a defined subject, a start date, a stop date, a due date, and a duration. You can think of this table for things like a tasks table, kind of like Planner, or for project management. If anybody here has used Microsoft Project, the activity table is essentially very close to that. So the activity table can be used for those. They are essentially life activities, and it does change slightly how the table behaves. We then have virtual tables. So virtual tables are basically to be used when you need the table to be populated data with data from an external data source. So if I choose virtual table here, you'll see that it then goes choose data source, and I can look through this and I can say, there's loads of different things I can choose to have it create. What this does is essentially create a table that reflects this other data source. So I mentioned about this when we look at the new table option here. If I hit create virtual table, we wait for it to load. You basically choose a connector, so things like SQL Server, Snowflake, Fabric, Salesforce, and then SharePoint ones. Please ignore the amount of connections I have in here. It is a dev environment. And then what happens is when I, let's say for instance, click SharePoint and hit next, it then goes, hey, choose a SharePoint site, choose a list, and then it's going to pull through the data and essentially create a mirror image of that table as a Dataverse table. It is worth noting, however, that virtual tables are sometimes a little bit tricky in terms of um, changing them. You won't get the same amount of options. And then the very last table type we have was elastic tables. Now, elastic tables are a bit different. They look like normal tables, but they should be used when the table will store data sets in the excess of tens of millions of rows, right? The standard tables that are produced do start to see a performance impact once you get to a very high number of rows. With the elastic tables, that's kind of minimized. So when you know you're going to be collecting like tens of millions of rows of data, use your elastic tables. They're very useful. So that's the different types. But as you can see, when we click advanced options, we have a number of other options in here, and I want to kind of cover some of the ones that are a lot of the times asked about on the PL-200 exam. And one of the major ones that's asked about is this record ownership, and it's really worthwhile knowing about this record ownership because it can change how your table behaves. So record ownership mainly impacts the security roles associated with the table. So you have two options. You have user or team. User or team record ownership allows for permission levels to essentially that are decided for this table when it comes to security rules, which we'll discuss later, to be sorry, pausing, allows permission levels to be either user, business unit, parent-child business unit, or organization. And it also enables reassignment of records to different users. Now, this will make a bit more sense when we look at security roles, but essentially it gives you the full breadth of options when it comes to defining security roles and what level of access a single user or team might have to the records. The data that sits within a table that has record ownership set to user or team belongs to a user or team, and actions performed on that data can be controlled at that individual user level. The other option we have in there is organization. So if a table has its record ownership set to organization, a security role that is associated with that table will only be able to be set up so that either the user can perform the action or can't. So when we look at security roles, there are options like being able to create, update, read, or write items. If you have the record ownership set to the organization option, what ends up happening is users are either able to do that action on all the records in that table or aren't able to perform the action on all records in that table. It's as simple as that. So, few things to note. There are a few other options in this kind of advanced options that are worthwhile. Obviously, when I close the advanced options, you've got a few other bits. I'm just going to put when I choose standard, the enable attachments option. So enable attachments, notes, or files. Basically, there is a inbuilt standard table in here called attachments. If you enable attachments, you can basically create notes and files against a record, and it will go into that table. The other things to note in here is that advanced options will also enable you to apply duplicate detection rules. So duplicate detection rules are essentially a kind of data management feature. What they allow you to do is, as it says, detect potential duplicates and then manage them from there. We will dig into duplicate detection rules another time in another session, but it's worthwhile noting that during table creation, if you use the advanced options, you have the option to apply duplicate detection rules here automatically. It also allows you to do things like enable auditing on the table. We will discuss auditing a bit later because there are a few options and a few pitfalls that happen, and actually something that comes up quite often on the PL-200 that we'll look into. Um, you can also set the table so that it appears in search results or doesn't appear in search results. So you see rows in this table. You could set it so that if someone searches for something, rows in that table can turn up on a search. If you turn that off, then we're all good. We also have the option to have the table be taken offline. Really useful for if you're doing things like extending. Let's say you get into the dynamic space and you go for the field operations kind of tables and the field operations module. A lot of the tables that are in there can be taken offline because obviously when you're doing field operations, you may not have good signal. So it's worthwhile noting that this is here. Um, yeah, really useful to note that these advanced options do allow another thing. Another thing that's worth noting, and it's an option that quite often gets missed, is the primary column, right? Every table has to have a primary column. This primary column has to be single line of text. However, if you decide you want to change in terms of things like the column requirement or the maximum character count, you can do it at the creation point of the table. It doesn't just have to be done after you create the table. You can come at the primary column, change the column requirement, and change the maximum character count. By default, it's set to 850. You can kind of up it slightly, but generally 850 is fine. Now, one more thing that is worth noting, and we'll get into kind of solutions and how they're done at another session. But for those that have worked with solutions, there is something called a publisher. When you create a new solution in a Power Platform environment, you have to define a publisher. If you create a table from a solution, the prefix that sits on the schema name is defined by the publisher, and that's the schema name for both the table, see here, CR9CD, which is the default publisher for my environment, and the primary column will both have that schema name. If I were to go into a solution, let's go for this one here, and I do the same thing in terms of going to new table advanced options, and then I look at the schema name prefix, you can see that that's changed. So if you want to make sure that your table has that prefix in it and is using the correct publisher, build it inside of a solution. That'll change how that works. Okay, pausing there for any questions or a brief pause for anybody that may want to post something into the chat. If not, we are moving on to the next bit in terms of actually sorting out tables and managing tables. Jace, questions? Okay, right. So what happens once we create
Oh,
a new
sorry. I
table?
think
Oh.
I've been muted, maybe.
No
My
problems,
bad.
Jace. What's going on?
Um, a question back to the role of the functional consultant when we were on that topic.
Yep.
You mentioned that keeping yourself and staying up to date is a part of being a functional consultant. Is that
Yes.
something that actually will be tested in the PL200?
It's not something that will be tested in the PL-200, but what I would be aware of is that when it comes to kind of actually being a functional consultant, it's something you have to know about. It is also worthwhile noting that obviously the PL-200 does get updated, so if you're not up to date with what's happening kind of now, you might be tested on something that's been added and is new.
Awesome. We also have a question from El Chico. Why would you choose activity table over standard? Standard
That
table can handle time and date.
That is a really good question, and it's purely because if you choose an activity table, a number of things are already enabled and a number of columns are already added. And actually, I can give an example of this now. So if I come into Table Advanced Properties and let's say Test Standard, right? I'm not going to change anything in terms of the primary column or anything else. This is just a standard table. We have it as user owned. We have applied detection rules and a few other bits, and yeah, we're not too bothered about that. We hit save on that. And what we end up with once it saves is a few of the standard columns for a table. And this is one of the big differences. Bear with it while it loads. Coming to the column section, we have just our primary name column and we have a few standard columns. You could configure this to essentially do the date and time and put the start date and others. But actually, if I come in here and I hit Table Advanced Properties and I go Test Activity, and I change this to an activity table, you'll see that enable attachments is already enabled, and you will see that choosing this option will set the primary column to subject. Displaying in activity menus is also an option. So if you have a core record that you want to attach an activity to, you'll be able to choose new activity or new test activity as an option. So it ties it in with being able to add specific activities against a specific record, right? So when I look at this, the display name gets set to subject. We have a schema name there, business requirement, a few other bits. But if I hit save, this is where the big difference comes in when it comes to activity tables. Once it builds it, this normally takes a little bit longer than your standard table purely because the amount it has to do.
It always takes twice as long as someone is watching. That's
Yes,
just the rule of building
every
tables.
time. I'm gonna hold my hands up, say, might be having minor issues here, but it doesn't normally take this long. We'll wait and see.
I mean, it's Friday. Maybe it's
It's update day.
already gone off for the weekend.
Entirely possible. Tell you what, for now, let's go for. Hey, there we go. I created it as soon as I navigated away. Always happy. So if I go into columns here, you can see here that we've got the activity ID, but we've also got activity type. We've got its actual duration, its actual end, its actual start. It's CC BCC because this also takes account of things like emails. Emails are classed as an activity item. Um, Currency, customers. So it has a number of pre-built columns already in there for you. That's one of the main reasons why you might pick the activity table over, let's say, a standard table because you have all these pre-built bits in there. A lot of activity tables will have these in because what's one of a good example of this? Um, I'll put it this way. So one of the Dynamics CRM tables is an activity table, and it tracks activities that have occurred against, let's say, a ticketing system. Um, and what you end up doing is there's a control called a timeline control in model-driven apps. When you add the timeline control, you can add a new activity to that, and it's things like emails, like telephone calls, like for instance, notes against it. These are all classed as activities and notes. Hopefully that answers the question. Okay, so we've actually done the table creation bit, which is all good. So We've looked at table creation. We now know what the different types of table are, what they potentially might be used for. We've looked at the record ownership that has a rather large impact on that table. We'll understand that impact a bit more later on in the session when we look at security rules. And we've also looked at some of the things to know when we create a table. That's all well and good. We've created our table. We actually now need to manage it, right? So, table management. How does it work? What do we do? Well, this is relatively easy. Okay, so when we look at it, we have our table management as part of the table. So I'm going to choose my test standard table there because we'll do this on a standard table because it gives us most of the options. When we look at table management, we've essentially got three sections and they're all sat up here. So we've got schema, data experiences, and customizations. And each section does something slightly different. So when we look at schema, the schema of a table is the items that make up the structure of the table. So these are things like the columns, the relationships, and the keys. Columns are pretty self-explanatory. When we go into the columns, you can view all the columns present in your table. So if I click on columns here, you can see here we've got all the standard tables that are part of it. We have the ability to create new columns where we define a display name, the data type, and other bits. And we have the option to kind of go in and edit columns. That's us editing the schema, the columns that are part of our table. We then have relationships. This relationship section is really important. I've said that Microsoft Dataverse is a relational database. These relationships are basically what defines what data is related to what table is related to what. When it comes down to the actual schema of a table, the relationships section, if we click in, shows you all the different relationships that this table has. Now, as in a newly created table like we've got here, there are already relationships established. So if we look at that, we've got things like the created by is linked to the users table. We've got things like the modified by, again, linked to the users table. We've got the owner is linked to the owner table. We've got the owning business unit being linked to the business unit table, the owning team linked to the team table, so on and so forth. And you can see here that we have a number of relationship types. Now we'll discover what those relationship types are in the next section, which is about relationship management. But for now, we have the option, obviously, within relationships to define a new relationship, and we can see the three different relationship types there. So many to one to many, and many to many. When we're defining what our table schema is, what the structure of our table is, relationships do play a part of that, and that's why they're in this schema section. And then we have the keys part. Now, the keys part is relatively not complex to explain. So, as we might be aware, all table rows within Dataverse have a GUID. Now, this is a unique identifier for that specific row. Okay, these GUIDs are complex and mean pretty much nothing to us. There's no recognizable data in there, right? Um, they are classed as the primary key for the table. And for anybody that's done kind of work um, in terms of SQL, will know what primary key and foreign keys are. But essentially, the primary keys for a table are unique identifiers. The keys section in the schema section allows for alternate keys to be created um, from the combination of data from other columns. So if we go into the keys section here, you can see here that right now I have no alternate keys. If I hit new key, I can choose from a list of columns that are already in there a combination of data that creates a unique identifier for that. It's worthwhile noting that in keys, only decimal, integer, single line of text, date and time, lookup, and choice columns can be used. So these are these are the only data types that can be used for defining alternate keys. So if I choose, let's say, import sequence number, name, and record created on, and I'm going to call this alternate key 1, hit save. Key's too large. So that's another limitation. The actual key size can't be more than 1700 bytes. So I'm going to remove import sequence number because more than likely that's the one that's causing it. Apparently not. We're having a fit today, apparently. There we go. So I've now defined essentially an alternate key that I can use to search for unique identifiers inside the table. And it also means that when I come to create a relationship between this table and another table, if this one is essentially the parent record, I can have that alternate key kind of do what it needs to do in terms of searching. Um, Again, worthwhile noting that for the PL-200, all you really need to know is that the keys section can be used to define alternate keys in the table and what data types will be what data types can be used. So, also worthwhile noting, you can only have 10 different keys for a table, and each key can't have any more than 16 columns included in it. One of the major benefits of alternate keys is that it can be used where you are interfacing with an external data system that can't store the GUID due to duplicates not being allowed in alternate key columns. This gives each row a unique ID separate from the GUID. So let's say you define a combination of columns as an alternate key in your table. And let's say you try to create another record that has the same value in every single one of those kind of combination of columns as another record, it's going to reject the capability to do that. So again, alternate keys, very useful. The exam might ask if an alternate key column is indexed. I had this question turn up on one of my previous exams, and I've had it turn up on practice exams. Um, it is. The column is always indexed. Okay, so that's the schema section. The data experiences section. Now, this is all about interfaces. This is all about what the user sees when they come and interact with this table in, let's say, a model-driven app or elsewhere. When we look at data experiences, like I said, these are items users will interact with when data from the table is shown in an app or site. We have a few sections, just like the schema section. We have forms, views, charts, and dashboards. The forms section predominantly decides how your user interacts with data when they're creating or editing items in either Power Pages or model-driven apps, but also when interacting directly with the table. So when we look at the forms section, there are multiple different types of forms. So we have main, quick view, card as a standard that turns up. Um, There is one other, which is quick create, which is dealt with when you're creating a related record from a subgrid. This table doesn't have one built in. The main view is what happens when they're interacting. The main form, sorry, is what is used when they're interacting with the data via that specific table. The quick view form is used for, let's say you wanted to display information about this record or a record from this table on another record that was related to it. That's where the quick view form is used. Um, and the card view, I have yet to use. I'll hold my hands up and say that. But we need to be aware that it's there and we might get asked about it in terms of what the view types are within the exam. If we were looking to kind of create a new form, obviously we're in the form section, same as everything else, you can choose new form. You'll have to bear with me because this is new. Uh, we've got main view, quick view form, and card form. Now, if you see here, quick create form, that's currently blanked out. That's probably because I don't have any relationships defined against this that would require a quick create form. We choose a form name, choose a description, and then we create the form. The interface is relatively easy. We can look at it and we can just drag and drop fields onto here. We can add things like tabs and other bits. It essentially just changes how the form looks. So that's when a user's interacting with or editing a specific row within the table. What happens if they just want to view all the records in the table? Well, that's where the views section comes in. So we have over here the views section just there. So when we click on views, we have all the views that are currently here. So again, different view types are available to us. So there is things like the quick find views, the advanced find views, the associated views, the lookup views, and public views. When we look at it, essentially these views define how people view your data. When we look at it, we have public views, lookup views, associated views, quick find views, and advanced views, like I said. The public views deal with create, read, update, and delete information, you're able to do that from a public view. Lookup views deal with specifically update. Associated views also deal with update, as do quick find views and advanced find views. In terms of creating a new view, it's relatively easy. Similar to the forms, hit new view, put it in, and then you're greeted with something that looks kind of similar to this. Drag and drop your items on, and off we go. Again, these define how people view a full table of your data. So we then have the charts option. So if I come back over here and I click charts, there are no charts that are created with a new table. When you press new chart, you'll get taken to a slightly different editor. It takes you to a Dynamics URL, as you can see here, and we see the old classic editor for charts. In here, you can create things like column charts, bar charts, area charts, line charts, pie charts, and funnel charts based upon your data to be able to display them to a user via a dashboard. Um, in terms of kind of the PL-200, it's worthwhile noting that these are there and it takes you into the classic view. You might get quizzed on them. But the other option you should really look at is obviously from a real world perspective. A lot of the time, if we're doing charts and dashboards, we tend to do these in Power BI. Okay, we will cover a little bit of Power BI again later in the course. And then we have the dashboard section. So dashboards allow you to create a 2 to 4 column dashboard that pulls multiple charts from that chart section on a page. Um, from experience, in terms of the practice exams, I've not been asked too much about them. Um, but again, that's not to say they won't turn up. It's worthwhile noting they are there, what they're there for, and what they do. So, taking a brief pause in terms of the table management, are there any questions?
We had a question here from El Chico.
Yep.
Are relationships in Dataverse based only on the primary column, or can you use an alternate key column in the lookup as well?
So you can only use, so when it's Dataverse to Dataverse tables, they're based on the primary column. You don't use the alternate keys. If it were to be, let's say, Dataverse to an SQL, you could load the alternate key over to the SQL database and then use a kind of querying setup to query the Dataverse table based upon the Dataverse web API via that alternate key. So yeah, in answer to the question, when it's Dataverse to Dataverse, it is the primary key only. And there is a reason for that. Um, Main reason being, if you were starting to work with alternate keys in terms of replacing the primary key with that alternate key, when it comes to things like running through Power Automate, Power Automate is designed specifically to deal with just the primary key. And if we were to unpick that, it'd cause Power Automate to kind of fall over a bit. Okay, so the next section, customizations. Now, I would like to talk about the row summary bit, but it's only enabled when admins enable insight cards in the admin center. Those aren't enabled on my environment. It is a relatively new feature, so there's not much I can talk about it, but I can talk about business rules and commands. So the customizations, when it comes down to table management, the customizations are all the extra stuff that kind of the usage of Dataverse enables for us over and above the standard database options. So business rules being a big thing. What are business rules? Well, these are things that allow you to apply logic and validations at the data level. These are really, really useful and powerful because it prevents you from having to write it for every application that you may use the table in. So they can be used to do things like validate data that's already stored or show error messages when new data is being created, change things like the field requirements based upon data that's input while they're doing it, while users doing it in the model-driven app, dynamically display data such as hiding fields or columns, and they can create things like business recommendations on the form dependent on kind of business intelligence. They have three main components. So if we actually go into the business rules section, just here, and I hit new business rule, we're going to be taken to the classic view again when we look at it. So our three main components are a condition, which we can see up there, um, an action, and a scope. So if we look at this, we have the condition here. We have a set of actions here, so I can lock or unlock fields, show an error message. I can set the value of a field, set the default value, set a field as visible required, or set its visibility, or provide a recommendation. Those are all our actions that are available to us. And let's say I bring this across. Let's have a look at the condition. When we come in here, I'm going to say created by equals, let's say, let's go for one of my test users. There we go. So if the created by equals that person, what I want to do is create a recommendation. And that's going to be that the name, uh, we give it a title. Johnson. So essentially what it's going to do is it's going to do things when it meets that condition. And then I said the third part of it was the scope. Now this is really important. I would definitely note this down. When we look at the scope, it's up here in the right. It looks small and innocuous, but it has a really powerful kind of usage. When we press the scope, we have three options. We have the entity, all forms, and information. What that means is if you choose entity as the option for the scope, that means that no matter where this table is used, this business rule will run. Okay? That means everything, any form it uses, any place where it's the table receives data. So for instance, from a Canvas app, this is going to try to run. If you choose all forms, it appears on all the forms in terms of things like, if you're editing data in a model-driven app using the main form, if you use the quick create form from a subgrade, these business rules are going to run. And then you can choose specific forms that you want it to do. So for instance, the one that's called information on this one is just the main form. So the reason why that's really powerful is you can target where those business rules take hold and what they do. And it's really, really important that we know that because it does change exactly where they run and how they operate. But that's business rules. Then the other option we have in terms of the customizations is commands. Now, this has had a bit of a change up recently. We now have the ability to edit the command bar. We have an option to choose the command bar to edit. So we've got main grid, main form, subgrid view, or associated view. And obviously, these are the command bars that show up in these specific areas. When we hit edit, we get a view of all the commands that appear in the command bar, and we can create new commands. We can customize the command bar and other bits and just change how it looks. So commands is not something we're going to dig into too much, but essentially it's worthwhile noting that that is part of the table management in terms of if you want a specific table to have the ability to call a web resource script from the command bar, that's where you do it. That command section lists out the commands available on the command bar. It's there. It's worthwhile noting that you are now able to create PowerFX commands from in there and other bits as well. And then that is the customization section, and it is also the table management section as well. So we now know about how we create our tables. We now know about how we manage our tables, which is good. It's a good thing to know, and it's something that is talked about in the exam, and you'll find it on the learning pathway as well. But that's all well and good. We've created our table, we've customized it, we've managed it. Great. But we've only got one table. What do we need to do? Well, we need to do relationship management. So, when we look at relationship management, essentially this is tying tables to each other. So what does that mean? Well, really all it means is when we look at things like, I'm going to use a solution that I have before. I'm going to use the library tracking system, and I'm going to go into my authors table. Now, every author has a set of books against them, but if I go to relationships, you can see here that I've got an author to books, one to many relationship. Well, what does that mean? Well, actually, when I come into my books table here, where I established a relationship between the authors and the books, and I
You
find
forgot to
here,
change view wheel.
thank you very much. There we go, authors. Going back over that again, so when I come into my authors table and I hit relationships, You'll see at the very top there, that's a custom defined relationship that I've created. It's not one of the normal ones where you've got a duplicate record and user and other bits. It is a one-to-many relationship between author, which is the parent item, and books, which means one author can be listed against many books. When I come into books and I look at this, what that means is I have, for a one-to-many relationship, an author column right here. Now, if I were to edit this and I look at author, I'm hoping this is going to work today. Maybe not. Right, we'll run it in the app then. So because I've established that relationship, you can see here, I've got authors. I can create a new author and I can go, let's say, ooh, what authors? Do you know what? Why not? Save and close. So that's that. I come into books. And if I look at this bit here, we've actually got a slightly different design on this column because it has a relationship to the authors table. What it's doing is essentially linking those tables together, right? Now, there are different relationship types. So if I come into this to the authors table here as a good example, and I go to relationships, you can see here I've got one to many, many to one. Well, actually, within Dataverse, there are three different relationship types. There is one to many, where one record from the table that you are establishing the relationship from is related to many in the other table. So this is what they term parent-child relationships. If you are looking at relationship and it says one to many, so within obviously this authors table, we have a one to many here. That means this table here on the left, the author table in this case, is the parent of the items in the books table. Okay. We then have many to one. This is the reverse. So if I were to go into my books table over here and I look at relationships, you can see here that I have a many to one between the books table and the authors table. It is the reverse. It means that this specific table that I'm looking at, and I'm looking in the relationship section, is a child table of that other table. And then there is a third relationship type that we don't have in here, which is called many to many. Now, this is where multiple items in the books table could be related to multiple, for instance, let's say accounts, right? These work slightly differently, okay? The other two relationships, when you establish them, actually create a column in the child table. So where I'm in authors, if I come into books and I go columns, you can see in here I've got a lookup column there. That's basically being created because I established that relationship. And I can actually show that here. If I come into relationships and I hit new and I go relationship and we go one to many, or let's go many to one between books and let's go for contacts. It's going to ask me to create a lookup display column. If I hit done, it's going to generate that. So what I'm trying to show here is that's a visual indication. If you are seeing lookup columns in your tables, there is a relationship established between that table and whatever table it's referring to. Okay? When we look at many to many relationships, there isn't a lookup column created, so it's worthwhile noting that. So with that being the three types, for each of the relationship types, there's actually a subtype. So when I come into the relationships and I click on, let's say, author, and I go into advanced options, or they moved it under general? No, it is under advanced options. You can see here, we have relationship behavior. This is the subtype I'm referring to. So there are a few different types of behavior. There is referential, parental, and custom. So parental basically means that if you have a parental relationship between a child record and a parent record, any actions such as the parent item being having its owner changed or being deleted, any action taken on that parent item is also then done to the child. So what that means is essentially If you have parental relationships set up, then I turn around and go, I've got an author that has 50 books. Let's keep with that analogy. And I delete that author. All 50 of those book records are going to be deleted. They're gone. Okay. We then have referential. So when we look at referential, this is slightly different. Referential basically means if I delete the parent item, the child items kind of will not be deleted. So you can see here, we can choose what the delete option is. It can either be remove link or restrict. So that changes a bit of the cascading behavior that we've got there. Remove link basically means when it's referential that if I delete the parent record, the child record just has the lookup column made blank, right? If it's set to restrict, then it'll stop me from deleting the parent item unless I delete the children. There is an analogy for this, which is really useful. I'll have to try and find it. And then we have the third subtype, which is custom. So if I go into advanced options and I hit custom, we then get all this information here. Now, this is known as cascading behavior. So these are, when I mentioned about the parental type, when I was saying any action that gets taken out on the parent item gets put on the child. If you choose custom, you'll be able to see what actions that actually means. So these are things like the parent item being deleted, the parent item being reassigned, the parent item being shared, unshared, or reparented itself, right? Custom allows us as a relationship type to define what happened, what behavior happens, and these do have slight differences. You can see here we have cascade all, remove link, restrict for delete. We have for assignment cascade all, cascade active, cascade user run, and cascade none. And then you can see that we have different options for each. But what does that cascade actually mean? Cascading behavior is really important to understand for relationship management, okay, and setting those up. And it should be something that when you're creating your relationships, should be looked at and should be understood before you start actually moving things into test, because it is very, very important. So what are our options when we look at cascading behavior? Obviously, with that drop down, we saw a few. I'm going to go through each of them. So the very first one, cascade active. This essentially cascades any changes that are done, such as if we look at this delete option. Um, sorry, let's go for the assign option. Cascade active, right? If I reassign a parent record and the relationship behavior for cascading on assignment is set to cascade active, any active rows that are related to that parent item will also then be reassigned. Um, Cascade all just is exactly as it sounds. Any changes that are made will cascade to all record. Cascade none basically disables the behavior. So, for instance, if I set the cascade uh, assignment behavior to cascade none, if I reassign the parent record, none of the child records are going to be reassigned. We then have remove link. As I've said, it basically removes the value of the referencing column, the lookup column for all records associated with the parent row. We have restrict, which prevents the referenced row, the parent row, from being deleted when referencing tables still exist or referencing records still exist. And then we've got cascade user owned. Now, cascade user owned is a bit different. This cascades changes on all records referencing the table that are owned by the user initiating the change. So, for instance, let's say I go into the authors table and I'm the owner of the record called Darren Shan, and he has 50 books in there, and 25 of them I'm listed as the owner for, and 25 of them, let's say Jace is listed as the owner for. I turn around and I decide I'm going to reassign the author Darren Shan to be someone else or to someone else. That's going to cascade down to the 25 records that I owned if cascade user owned is selected. Um, yeah, that's relationships in terms of obviously setting them up, identifying what happens when we create a one-to-many and many-to-one relationship, the different types of kind of referential behavior that we have in terms of our parental, referential, and custom options and what that does, and then the cascading behaviors, what the options there do in terms of actions that are taken against parent records and how those might move down to child records. Um, I would really encourage kind of people who are looking into kind of the PL-200 side of things, go and have a play with Dataverse in terms of this relationship management, because especially when it comes to custom behavior, there's a lot of difference, and it's really useful to kind of get a bit of hands-on work to be able to see how it operates and understand it a bit more. But yeah, taking a pause there before we move on for any questions bef- before we get into some of the security kind of implementation and how that works.
I have a little question there about the cascading active. So,
Hmm.
did I get that right? So, let's say that I'm the author of, let's say, 20 books,
Yep.
and 10 of them are marked as inactive, and I want to change, um, let's say I want to change the account number that the payment goes out to or something.
Yep.
If it was set to cascading active, it would only change for the actively selling books and not the ones that are inactive. Did I get that right?
Yes. Yeah, essentially. Let's say it was a lookup column, you change the parent record, right? When we look at obviously that change, it's only behavior that is identified. One second, let's pull it up. Set it custom. It's only these actions. So if you, let's say we had the option on delete, because this is an easy one to understand. Let's say we had the option in delete to cascade active, right? So in that situation, you've got a lookup to the 20 the 50 books and 25 of them are active, and we were able to set this to cascade active. It would only delete the 25 books related to that author that are marked as active rather than the full 50. Make sense?
You cut out just in the middle of that sentence. Sorry. Could you take that
Okay,
again?
no problems. So when we look at obviously the delete action, if we were able to set this to cascade active and we look at the author and he's got 50 books, right? And 25 of those books are marked as inactive records. Okay. We delete the parent item, the author, so to speak, the author record. If we were able to set delete to cascade active, it would then go and delete the 25 active books. It would leave the inactive records alone.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Just as a point on one of the relationship types, and this is not something that entirely will be covered by the PL-200, but it's worthwhile knowing in terms of real world kind of work. When you create a many-to-many relationship, it doesn't obviously create a lookup column. I did briefly mention that, like the one-to-many and many-to-one do. Instead, what it does is it creates something called a junction table. Now, by creating a many-to-many relationship kind of through this interface, let's say I'm going to create a count. What will happen is it will create a table that has two lookup columns in it. One to the authors table, because that's where we are at the moment, and one to the account table. Um, that table that it creates with those two lookup columns in, you can't access, you can't query using Power Automate, you can't really retrieve data from it easily, and you can't add additional columns to it. So from a real world experience point of view, what pretty much most developers tend to do is create their own junction table, right? They create just another standard table that has those two columns in, and that way we can treat it like a normal junction table. Um, that is the way I have approached many to many since learning about the fact that junction tables that are created through the many to many aren't really accessible in the way that we need them to be, and you can't add additional kind of items to it. For instance, really good example of this was uh, a tool we built for doing training management, right? So we had a table that was called courses, a table that was called bookings, a table that was called sessions, and then users as well. And then we had the users table. Now, one user could book on multiple sessions, and we had obviously a many-to-many setup there. What we ended up doing was doing a sessions to users table that we created ourselves, but we tried doing that using the many-to-many setup first, but we then got a requirement to be able to track whether that user had attended that session or not, right? So when we looked at it, we were going, right, we should just be able to add a column to that junction table that has been created using the many-to-many. We weren't able to, so we created a standard table instead and replaced it, and it worked exactly the same. So being clear on this, for the purpose of the exam, be aware that many-to-many tables are an option, but also from a real-world perspective, sometimes you need the ability to extend those tables, query them from Power Automate, and that requirement might not always be there from the start. So sometimes it's worth, if you identify a many-to-many relationship in your kind of planning phase, to create that junction table yourself. Okay, so we now know all about relationship management. It's great. We've set up our tables, we've managed them, we've added our columns, we've done what we need to do. Great. But right now, nobody is able to access those tables. And if they are able to access those tables, they can access everything in them. How do we secure them? Well, this is where the next thing that Dataverse brings us is very, very powerful. And these are security rules. So security rules, what are they? They're basically something that you can create to assign a user permissions to a table. They are really, really, really useful, and especially when it comes to Dataverse, they're pretty much essential. So how do we create them? Well, relatively easily, he says. We actually create security rules through the Power Platform Admin Center. So when we look at that, how do we get to the Power Platform Admin Center? Well, from the Power Apps homepage, which you can see here, we go to the little cog icon here and then hit Admin Center. Looking at the Admin Center, we then go to our environments once it loads. You see over here, environments, and we go to the environment that we want to create the security role in. And you'll see just over here, we have the security roles option. So we hit see all, and then we should see all the security roles that are present in our environment. He says, there we go. Unsure why that toggles on, but there we go. So you can see here, I've got loads and loads and loads of security roles in here. There's a load that are in there as standard. So things like your system administrator security role, that's a standard role. Basic user security role, that's a standard role. And things like your approvals user flows are approvals users security roles are in there. A lot of the ones that are in there as standard, you'll see under the managed bit, will say yes. A lot of your custom ones that you'll end up creating will be listed as no. So I think I have a few in here as standard. So you can see there, managed listed as no. So those are security roles that I've created before. But what are security roles? What do they do? How do we use them? Bits like that. So they're essentially what define our table permissions, like I said. So how do we create one? Well, dead easy. We have this new role option up in here. Now this is what you do to create a new role from blank. So if we hit new role, so we have here, we define a role name. So I'm going to give this testing role. And we define a business unit. Now you have to define a business unit as part of defining a security role. Every single Dataverse enabled environment, in fact every single environment, will have at least one business unit in it, and more than likely it'll be the word org with a number of letters. This business unit is basically has everybody in it. This business unit doesn't define who has been given that security role. It just defines the business unit that kind of has access to that. It does have a bit of an impact in terms of once you set up business unit hierarchies and other bits, but we won't get into that at the moment. So when creating a security role, you'll have to select a business unit, like I said, that the role falls under, and then you can set a few things. So one of the things that we've got in here is member privilege inheritance. And when we click that drop down, we have two options: team privileges only and direct user basic access level and team privileges. But what do these two options mean? Well, direct user basic means that the user that has got the security role is given the privileges of the security role directly when it's assigned. They can access records that they've created or owned and can create records that they are the owner of. The other option is team. This is where a user is given kind of these as a member of team, and they can only access and create records that the team owns. Now that makes sense when we look at things like uh, the tables. Bear with me one moment while my mouse disappears. When we look at the tables and we look at things like, I'm going to go for GEF questions, and I find the owner column. Every single one of these tables has an owner column right there. So you can see that I've got a list of users in there. I can't edit that. That's essentially the owner of that item. You can have records that are owned by a team of people, not just an individual. So most of the time when you're creating security rules, you're probably going to be using direct user basic access level and team privileges. This tick box here also means that you can give someone the app opener privileges for running model driven apps if they're going to be using them. So I'm going to hit save on this, and I'm going to use direct user basic access level. Now, once we've done that, we can see that we get a load of permission types. So we have the options for create, read, write, delete, append, append to, and assign. Now, obviously, create, read, write, delete are all very much self-explanatory. But we've got these three on the end: append, append to, and assign. What do they actually mean? Well, this is where we get into some of the relational datasheet modeling. I'm going to go through each of the permission types to give an overview, but really worthwhile paying attention to the append, append to, and assign sections. So obviously create allows it to curate records in the associated table, read allows them to read records, write allows them to make changes to an existing record, and delete allows them to delete a record. The append one on the end allows a user who has that permission to associate a record with another record for lookup column purposes. It's worth noting that in the case of many-to-many relationships, the security role that gives the user the permission to those tables must have the append permission on both tables. Otherwise, the many-to-many kind of work won't function. The append to option allows the user to associate a record in another table with the current record. So for instance, if we're looking at the authors and books setup again, for me to be able to essentially attach the author's record to a book, I need to have the append to permission um, against the books table. Then we have the assign permission. This allows a user to essentially change the ownership of a record to another user. And then we also have one more permission, which is hidden away all the way at the end, which is share, which self-explanatory allows you to give a user to give access to a record to another user while also keeping their own. Now, this interface, how we create a security role. So you can see in here, I've got a nice little drop down called Show All Tables. We have a list of tables here, which do a load of things. So we have options for business management, business process flows, core records, custom tables. So custom tables is where I'm going to be looking for now, and I'm just going to go GEF. So if I want to define what a user's permissions might be to a table, I can search for that table. You can see here I've got categories, questions, likes, or let's go for LTS. So right now this security role doesn't have any permissions against any of my library tracking solution kind of tables, so authors or books. Well, actually, I need the users to be able to have, let's say I'm building it for librarians. I need the users to be able to have organization level access on create and read and write and delete and append to, and so on and so forth, right? So they're just going to have organization level access. Well, actually, that's all well and good just take an organization, but what do these options mean? Each of those options does represent a slightly different permission level. So obviously we have the option for none. That's self-explanatory. The user's just not going to have that permission. We then have the next level up, which is user. This allows a user to perform that action on that table with the records that they own. So if they are listed in the owner, they'll be able to do that thing with that record. So pretty self-explanatory. We then have the next level up, which is business unit. So you can actually assign users to business units. We'll be showing that in a moment when we get to the grouping people. But this permission level allows the user to perform the action that you put it against with records that fall within the business unit that they are part of. We then have parent and child business units. Um, that's the next level up. This allows a user to perform the action that you assign it to with records in not only their business unit, but any business units that are a child of that business unit. This is where we get into the hierarchical permission and modeling of business units when we look at grouping people and a few other bits. Business units can become quite powerful, and we'll see that a bit more. And then we have organization. This is essentially the top level permissions. It basically says, hey, this user is allowed to perform this action on any records in this table, regardless of their business unit, their team, or anything like that, right? So this is normally what's used for admin rules. But yeah, very simple to create your kind of security rule. You define it, you change things, do what you need to do, and then you hit save and close. Job done. You've now created a security rule that you can give to people to be able to actually kind of be able to do things in the tables. So in terms of assigning that, that's relatively easy. We can come into the users table and just hit see all. And then let's say, we've got a user here. I'm just going to hit manage security rules and I'm going to choose, let's say, uh, a security rule that I want to give them. I believe testing rule. There we go. That's the role that I've just created. He's now got testing rule. Job done. I've assigned my permission. Great. One problem. Let's say you've got 5,000 users in your environment and you need to assign them each a security role. You do not want to be clicking 5,000 times to assign each individual security role. So how do we make this quick and easy? Well, this is where the next part of the session comes in, is grouping people. But before we get into that, does anybody have any questions on security rules or anything
We
else?
do. We do. We have a couple of questions.
Okay,
So El Chico is on fire with the questions tonight.
brilliant.
If you select a business unit other than the default, you cannot deploy that security role to a test environment. Does this mean that the only option is to manually replicate security roles in each environment?
So security roles are actually solution aware. You can bring them across. Even if you select one that isn't the default, I believe I'll have to double check, but the last time I did it, it created the business unit in there. Um, it didn't create the team though, which was a bit of a pain. It did cause an issue. But yeah, they are solution aware, so they can be moved into a test environment. So, good example of this, I actually have a solution that I can show that has a security role in it. Let's go for GEF, General Inquiries Forum. There we are. It is, however, just as a point, good practice as well, that before you do a deployment, because obviously things like teams and business units aren't solution aware, that you recreate the teams and business units in the target environment that you're going to be importing the solution into before you kind of bring it across. Um, yeah, here we go. GEF admin. Security roles solution aware, bring them across, works fine. Um, yeah, good question, El Chico. The last time I tried it, it had a bit of a problem, but that was a long time ago. So yeah, hopefully I answered the question. Any more questions?
We also had a question from also El Chico.
Yep.
Is there anywhere where you can find a good description of what each table are used for, referring to the security roles?
So in terms of the table types, is that what that we're after there?
I am actually not 100%.
It's something we can discuss. So, um, yeah, I think if I know El Chico's just asked to speak, so tell you what, I'll make sure we have a note for editor to remove this part because I know it's part three. But yeah, El Chico, how can we help? Oh, you should be able to speak. Huh? Not server muted or anything? No. Okay, El Chico, just for the sake of obviously session stuff, um, if I continue on, it's something we can look at when it comes to security rules and other bits. We can try and sort from there. Okay. Yeah, we will get to the discussion bit, and hopefully we can go from there. Okay, and seems like there's some healthy conversation in the chat as well, which is good. Now, one grouping people. This is a fun topic. I do like the grouping people topic. So, when we look at grouping people, this is again another bit that's done. Um, Oh, tables tables other than than custom. So things like your activity tables, your elastic tables, bits like that. Uh, Oddly enough, Microsoft Learn did a really good one, and there's a few blogs out there. I will dig them out, and I'll make sure I drop a message to you, or I'll drop it in the kind of Dataverse section of the learning, and try to get that in. All right, cool. Grouping people. So obviously, like I said, let's say we had 5,000 users. We don't want to have to manually add the security rule to every single new user that comes in or other bits. So there are two main ways to group people together. Um, each one of those two main ways has subtypes within. So when we're looking at the kind of admin center, when we came into our environment, you can see here we have teams and business units. These are our ways to group people. And we're going to start with teams. So you'll notice in here that there are an absolute load of teams. That's because I've been messing around and I've got Dataverse teams. But essentially, teams are just a way to essentially group people together, put them in the same place, and there is a few kind of types. So more specifically, there's 5 types, and we're actually going to look into them. So when I hit create team, I'm just going to testing team. We give it a name, we give it a description, we choose a business unit. I'm going to choose org for now, and then we choose an administrator. Now you choose your team type. Now I'm skipping over the kind of impact of the business unit administrator for now because the thing that PL-200 more focuses on a lot of the time is the team types and how you might group people. So, oh, it's changed. We've now only got 4 types. Cool. So there is owner, access, Microsoft Entra ID Security Group, which also used to be called Azure Active Directory Security Group for those who have been in Power Platform for a while, and Microsoft Entra ID Office Group, and each works slightly differently. So the owner team. What does the owner team do? Well, the owner team basically allows that team to own records and can have security roles assigned to the team. So when we look at it, if I come into this and I hit next, I can then just decide, right, I'm managing this team from inside the environment. I'm going to choose, I need to remember who's in this environment. So I'm going to choose that and there and then one more, and I'm going to hit next. Great. I've now created the team and I can now assign security roles to that team. Now all I've got to do to make sure a user has that security role is just add them to the team. Isn't that great? Not a problem. So we can go basic user and hit save. So now rather than having to, every time a new user comes in, having to make sure they access the environment, go into the users, manage their security roles and assign them, I can just assign the roles to the team. Great, not a problem. So let's say actually this team who has 3 members that I've added, I now want to give them, let's say, environment maker as an option. If I can find environment maker, it should be here. Environment maker. Right, great. Now that team has 2. So what's the other options? Well, there was access in there. So if we just untick testing team and we come in and we go access. Again, still have to choose a business unit, still have to choose an administrator, and then we choose access. So what does the access team do? Well, the access team basically makes it so that no a user in an access team can't own records. The access team as a whole cannot own a record and doesn't have security roles assigned. They have security roles defined by their individual account and by roles from other teams that they are a member of. Okay. Um, Personally, holding my hands up, I've never used an access team. I'd be really interested to see what others might have used access teams for. But it's worthwhile noting that you can't assign security roles from them, and each member's kind of security role is defined by what you have assigned them from the users table or by other teams that they are part of. Worthwhile also noting that users can be members of multiple teams, as identified by that. We then have the Microsoft Entra ID security group, which is, oddly enough, managed by Entra ID, by an Entra ID security group specifically. So just again, Microsoft Entra ID security group. Now you'll see that we get a slightly different view on this. Mine appears to be glitched out slightly, but you'll be asked to search for Microsoft Entra ID group name. Now I'm going to put in Dataverse. Right here is a security group that I have created in my Azure Active Directory / Microsoft Entra ID area, and I can basically turn around and go, right, anybody who's a member of that security group can just inherit these permissions. Now, a lot of the time when we're looking at solutions as a consultant, you'll have an internal business IT team that will manage the addition and removal of people from security groups based upon their job role. A lot of the time when we're doing kind of work in terms of with clients in that way and we need to give them security roles, it's managed through this Dataverse security group. And this Microsoft Entra ID security group kind of method, because then we can make sure that the people who are in that security group get the role automatically. You can also choose a membership type. So this is really powerful. Let's say you had a compliance team and you turn around and they were like, everybody in that compliance team is in that security group. The ones who are the managers who need to be able to see everything are owners in the security group. The ones who are just staff, they're members. Well, actually, you can define and say, let's say I was making this a testing Entra ID admin group. I could define it so that the owners of that security group are the members of this team. Hopefully that makes a bit of sense. So for now, I'm going to choose members. And just like an owner team, I can assign um, security roles to this. The only difference between this and the owner team is that the membership of the Dataverse team is defined by a security group, not by manually adding people and removing people in Dataverse. So, very simple. And then my personal favorite when it comes to teams is to, because I do a lot of work in terms of SharePoint backed apps, or at least to some degree they have a SharePoint element to them, is to use the Microsoft Entra ID Office group. So a good example of this, one of the solutions I'm working on at the moment, has a team site that holds documentation. The admins are owners on that site, and the standard users are members on that site. So I have created a Dataverse team which assigns them permission security roles based upon their membership status in that specific office group. So you can see here, I can turn around and go dev. I think I've got a dev one. There's a test. He says, sure I've got a test in here. Projects? There we go, projects team. So right there, members, owners, guests, so on and so forth. So you can create teams based on that, and then assign them security roles. So when we get into that space of obviously if we have a large amount of users, we have to start using teams and other methods to be able to group them up. But I did mention that there were two methods. Teams is one of the more common ways to do it, but we have business units as well. So if I hit CO and I look at business units, you'll see here that I have iHub A, iHub B, Dev Team, and the org. Now I mentioned that obviously every single environment has at least one business unit, and it's this org one. If I click on the business unit here, you can see that it has child business units that I've assigned it. But if I click on users, you can see that it's every user that's part of this environment is part of this business unit itself. Now, what's different about business units? So the org business unit that I showed there is the root business unit. It is one business unit for everything. Each business unit can have only one parent business unit, but can have multiple children. Each business unit can have security rules associated with them, just like teams. However, unlike teams, a user can only be assigned to a single business unit. They can't be part of multiple. Users cannot be added directly to a business unit upon coming into the environment. They are automatically assigned to the root business unit, that org business unit, but their business unit can be changed anytime in Entra ID. And for every business unit that we have, oddly enough, a team is created. So you can see here, dev team, that is an owner team that was actually created when I created this business unit here. Okay, but again, when we look at how we assign them security roles, it's not done in the business units area. You come into dev kitchen environment, you come to team, you find the team that's linked to that business unit. You can see there, business unit is listed as dev team, and then you manage security roles from there. I mentioned about the security roles having those different levels of permissions when it comes to business unit and parent-child business unit. If you are only using teams to manage the security roles, those options don't have any impact if you select them. So if you're only using teams, essentially what ends up happening is you are only have the option of user or organization. They either have access to only their own records or all the records in the table. This is why we use business units because they enable that kind of middle ground. And a really, really good use case for this is things like you have, let's say, a multinational company and you've got sales units all around one country, and then you've got a head of sales for that country. You might have business units kind of plowed down. So when we look at how that might be set up, you want the kind of head of the sales for that country to be able to see all the records for the sales business units that fall underneath it. In that situation, you would create a security role that has that parent-child business unit level for them to be able to view the records and edit them. Hopefully that makes a bit of sense, but that is our two ways of grouping people. Jace, do we have any questions?
No, not on this subject directly.
Okay, not a problem. And then we're on to our second to last topic, our last topic before the discussion, so we can all breathe a bit of a sigh, because I know it's been quite heavy, the additional security options. Now, I cover this purely because this is an offering that kind of Dataverse enables for us. This is stuff over and above what your standard databasing options give you. Now, there was a really, really brilliant post that was done about how Dataverse is more than database. I will have to try and dig it out. I will make sure I drop it in the server here. But we can take a good look at it, and it was really clear, better than I could have ever done it. So, but I'm going to cover here what some of the additional security options are that have a tendency to pop up on the PL-200, at least in terms of practice tests and some of the questions and kind of experience that I've had as well in kind of the consultancy arm. So, one of the big things, auditing. When we looked at table creation at the very kind of start of the session, I mentioned that when you create a table, you have the option to enable auditing for that table. So if I go back to tables and I hit new table and there, you can see here audit changes to its data. This table will not be audited until auditing is enabled for the organization. So Dataverse has a brilliant audit trail when it's enabled, okay? And I mean it tracks things like when an item is changed, when it's accessed, what the old value was, what the new value was, when it was changed, who changed it, everything. It really does cover a lot, and it's really, really, really powerful. Um, and it's something that's there available to us. So what does it do? Well, like I said, for enabled tables, it can capture when a row is created, deleted, shared, its relationship to a parent record changes, things like changes of ownership, and even just the standard changes to columns. For it to be active, it needs to be turned on at the organizational, environment, and table level. Well, what does that mean? Well, when we look at the kind of enabling it at the organizational environment level, that's all done in the kind of admin section. So we have the settings option here, and if I remember correctly, he says they've moved it. Helpful. Okay. I'll have to double check on that. It used to be in the settings section, you were able to type audit and then turn it on, but that doesn't look to be the case anymore. I wonder if they've popped it under security. There we go. Auditing. So when you look at this, auditing is under the security section. We then choose which ones we want to enable. So if I hit set up auditing for my dev kitchen environment, turn on the auditing, that's it now enabled at the kind of environment level and at the kind of organization level. And then I can choose what my audit log retention is. I can set it to forever, 7 years, 2 years, kind of go into there and enable that. So worthwhile noting. Very, very key bit of information I would advise is that, if you're looking at dealing with auditing and you want to learn you want to work on the PL-200 stuff, remember that it needs to be turned on at organizational environment and table level. And to view it as well, to view the audit history, a user must have the view audit history and view audit summary privileges in their security roles that they've been assigned. Um, As another additional, and I quite like this that they've done this, any auditing data that's held isn't actually contributing towards your Dataverse storage capacity either. It's held in audit storage, which is an entirely different capacity. So even if you reach like kind of max capacity on your Dataverse kind of environments in your tenant, your auditing will still occur. One of the other things that is available to us when we look at kind of the additional security options, if I remember correctly, is this data policy piece. Now, again, it's something I have seen pop up on practice tests, but essentially allows you to kind of provide a link to your company's privacy policy so that users can access it when they're going through things like Power Pages or through things like the monitoring apps that they might be using. It's worthwhile noting that this is obviously in the private security era, like I showed with a number of other kind of features in there. And then there is one other thing. There is also something called hierarchical security. Again, I'll have to remember how to enable this. I haven't enabled this for a long time. But if you come into settings and hierarchy security, there it is. Perfect. So right now it's disabled, but what does hierarchy security do? Essentially, it now allows you to enable users at higher positions to have access to the data of users at lower positions. This is done through essentially creating positions in a position table. Um, so here we go, enable position hierarchy. You can create positions by hitting configure. Give it a moment. There we go. So create a new position, identify what the parent position is and what the child position is. And what hierarchy security does basically means it creates a tier 3 system. So positions obviously created there. The manager of user must have a security role that has at least read level permissions on the table to see the data of the people, like if the people need them. Like I said, 3 tier system. Let's say I'm going to use a few people in this call to build that model. Let's say Jace was my manager and I managed Stu. Um, if we had positions set up in that manner, Jace would be able to see and edit the information that I owned because I am in the position immediately below him. And he would be able to read the information that Stu had created but not edited. I would be able to read and edit the information that Stu owned, and then Stu would only be able to see his stuff. That's how our position hierarchy works. Again, I've very rarely seen it used, although I know it is used in certain areas. But it's something that very quickly we can build a positional hierarchy quite rapidly off the back of maybe an org chart for a business and make that kind of position hierarchy a lot easier. Um, yeah, that is the additional security options that we have available and some of the things that will be obviously asked about potentially on the PL-200 and stuff we should know about for the PL-200. But yeah, that being said, Jace, are there any questions at the moment against all this?
No, not for the additional security roles. I think we all wrapped up for this session.
Brilliant. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful and got to learn something new, and I'll see you in the next one.